My name is Marjorie, and at 67 years old, I never expected to be starting over. After 42 years of marriage to Richard, becoming a widow left me vulnerable in ways I never imagined. Our Boston home held 4 decades of memories, but what my son Thomas didn't know was that Richard and I had a secret second home in Valencia, Spain. After the funeral, I noticed how Thomas began helping with my finances, his suggestions becoming demands. The final straw, his text message telling me he'd sold my house without permission. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from today. And please subscribe if you want to hear more stories about standing up for yourself, even when it's your own family. Richard and I built a beautiful life together over our 42 years of marriage. We met in college, both of us studying literature, though Richard eventually switched to finance when he realized his analytical mind was better suited for numbers. I stayed the course, becoming a high school English teacher, a career I treasured for 35 years until retirement. Richard climbed the corporate ladder at an international banking firm, eventually becoming a senior financial advisor, managing portfolios for wealthy clients. While we were never extravagantly rich, his career and my teaching position allowed us to live comfortably in our colonial-style home in a nice Boston suburb. We saved diligently, invested wisely, and by our 50s, we had accumulated substantial savings and a diverse investment portfolio. Our only child, Thomas, came along in our 3rd year of marriage. He was a sweet boy, with Richard's analytical mind and my love of stories. I remember reading to him every night, watching his imagination spark at adventures in faraway lands. Richard taught him chess and the basics of finance, hoping to instill the value of strategic thinking and careful planning. As Thomas grew into a teenager, I noticed subtle changes in his personality. He became increasingly focused on what others had, comparing our comfortable but modest lifestyle to the wealth of some of his friends, whose parents were doctors, executives, or old-money Bostonians. By college, his major had shifted from literature to business administration, his dreams centered on acquisition rather than fulfillment. He met Amanda during his MBA program. She came from a family that had once been wealthy but had fallen on harder times maintaining appearances at all costs. When they married, Richard whispered to me after a few too many glasses of champagne at their lavish wedding, "That girl will burn through money faster than Thomas can make it." Unfortunately, Richard's prediction proved accurate. Despite Thomas landing a good position at a marketing firm and Amanda working in public relations, they constantly seemed to be stretching beyond their means. The house, in the right neighborhood, the luxury cars, private schools for our grandchildren, Jackson and Sophia, lavish vacations, documented meticulously on social media, all creating an image of success that I suspected was built on credit cards and home equity loans. Richard privately worried about Thomas's financial habits. He never learned the patience part of wealth building. Richard confided in me one night after Thomas had called, asking for a loan to cover some investment opportunity that couldn't wait. Richard helped him, of course. We both loved our son deeply and wanted him to succeed. When Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, everything changed. During those 14 brutal months of treatment, he spent many hours putting our affairs in order, working with his longtime attorney and friend, Patricia. "Marjorie," he told me one night when the pain medication had worn off, but the next dose wasn't due yet, "I've made sure you'll be taken care of. But I worry about Thomas. He's going to expect more than is responsible for you to give him." Richard set up separate accounts and trusts, making sure our main house and primary accounts were properly documented, but also creating a separate structure for our Spanish property and a significant pension fund that would provide me with comfortable monthly income. The Spanish home was placed solely in my name, a decision Richard made deliberately after discussions with Patricia. Thomas doesn't know about Valencia, Richard reminded me a week before he passed, and I think it should stay that way until you're sure he understands that your security comes first. When Richard passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, I thought the worst pain in my life had arrived. I didn't know then that another kind of pain was waiting just around the corner. The funeral was beautiful in that terribly sad way that good funerals are. Hundreds came to pay their respects. Richard had touched many lives through his work and community involvement. I stood for hours, accepting condolences, in a fog of grief, Thomas at my side, with his arm protectively around my shoulders. In those first few days, Thomas was everything a grieving mother could hope for in a son. He helped arrange the service, manage the influx of food and flowers from well-wishers, and stayed in our guest room to make sure I wasn't alone. I was grateful for his presence as I tried to navigate a world that suddenly felt empty without Richard's quiet strength beside me. By the second week, however, the nature of Thomas's help began to shift. Casual questions about household finances turned into suggestions about what I should do with accounts and property. When Patricia came by with documents regarding Richard's will and the distribution of assets, Thomas insisted on sitting in on our meeting. I shared information about our main house and primary accounts, seeing no reason to hide these from my son. But following Richard's guidance, I didn't mention the Spanish property near Valencia or the separate pension fund Richard had established. Those topics simply didn't come up in conversation, and Patricia, understanding Richard's wishes, didn't bring them up either. As days turned to weeks, Thomas's attempts to help with financial matters grew more persistent. "Mom, let me handle this for you," became his constant refrain. "You shouldn't have to worry about money matters while you're grieving." The first real red flag appeared about a month after the funeral. Thomas arrived at my house with a stack of documents already marked with sticky notes, showing where I should sign. When I asked what they were, he vaguely mentioned just some financial transfers to simplify things, and continued flipping through the pages. Something in his tone reminded me of how he used to try to gloss over bad report cards in middle school. "I think I'll have Patricia look these over first," I said, setting them aside. Thomas's face tightened momentarily before relaxing into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mom, there's no need to bother Patricia with routine paperwork. Dad would have wanted things to be easy for you." That invocation of what Richard would have wanted became a regular feature of our interactions. It was as though Thomas had appointed himself the interpreter of his father's wishes, despite the clear instructions Richard had left behind. I stalled on signing anything, and secretly arranged to meet with Patricia at her office rather than my home. She confirmed what I had suspected: the documents would have given Thomas significant control over my assets, including the ability to sell my house. "He has no legal right to do any of this," Patricia assured me, her gray eyes stern behind stylish glasses. "Richard was very clear about keeping you financially independent." Meanwhile, Thomas's behavior grew more controlling. He began calling daily about selling the house, always framing it as being for my own good. "Mom, that house is too big for you to manage alone," he insisted. "You'll be so much happier in a smaller place with less upkeep. Plus, The market is hot right now. We could get top dollar." That "we" bothered me more than I could express. It was my house paid for, with decades of Richard's and my hard work, yet Thomas spoke as if he had an ownership stake in the decision. My neighbor and best friend Susan began to notice Thomas's frequent visits and the strain they seemed to put on me. Over coffee in her sunroom one morning, she gently asked, "Marjorie, is everything okay with Thomas? He seems to be around an awful lot." I found myself confiding in her about Thomas's pushiness regarding my finances. Susan listened attentively, her face growing concerned. "That doesn't sound like he's trying to help you," she said finally. "It sounds like he's trying to help himself." Her words stung because they articulated what I had been trying not to acknowledge. My own son, the little boy I had raised and loved, seemed more interested in his inheritance than in my well-being. The situation grew worse when I discovered that Thomas had been speaking to extended family members about me creating a narrative that I was unable to manage on my own. My sister-in-law called from Phoenix, concerned that I was struggling to cope, based on what Thomas had told her. My own brother emailed, asking if I needed to come stay with him because Thomas had mentioned I was having trouble maintaining the house. The reality was that I was grieving, but entirely capable. I had always managed our household budget, while Richard handled investments. I knew how to change furnace filters, who to call for plumbing emergencies, and exactly how much my comfortable lifestyle cost to maintain. But Thomas was systematically undermining my competence in the eyes of our family, positioning himself as the responsible son, taking care of his helpless mother. By the third month after Richard's death, Thomas's manipulation had taken a disturbing turn. He began suggesting I move to what he called a retirement community, that upon further investigation turned out to be an assisted living facility with limited independence for residents. "They have staff to help with medications and housekeeping," he explained enthusiastically, as though I needed assistance with either. "And there are activities every day, so you won't be lonely." I was 67, in good health, and perfectly capable of managing my daily life. The suggestion was not only unnecessary, but felt like an attempt to infantilize me. Things escalated when Thomas and Amanda started bringing real estate agents to the house without asking my permission first. I came home from my weekly lunch with Susan to find a stranger in my living room measuring windows and making notes. "Mom, this is Diane," Thomas said casually. "She's just getting some preliminary information for when we list the house." The presumption left me speechless. While I stood there trying to process what was happening, Amanda was already pointing out to Diane what she called outdated features that would need to be addressed before showing. After they left, I sat in Richard's study, my hands shaking with anger and distress. This was our home, where we had raised our family, celebrated holidays, and built our life together. The idea that Thomas and Amanda were planning to sell it out from under me was almost unthinkable. The next blow came when I discovered Thomas had gone through my personal files while I was grocery shopping. My filing cabinet in the study, which I always kept locked, was slightly ajar when I returned. The spare key, which had been hidden in Richard's desk drawer, was now sitting on top of the desk. When confronted, Thomas didn't even deny it. "I was just trying to get a complete picture of your finances, Mom," he said, with that condescending tone that had become so familiar. "There might be accounts or policies Dad set up that you've forgotten about." "I haven't forgotten anything, Thomas," I said firmly. "And those files are private." He patted my hand as though I were a confused child. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly yet. Grief can do that. Dad would want me to make sure everything's in order. There it was, again the invocation of Richard as justification for overstepping boundaries. It was manipulative and frankly insulting to both Richard's memory and my intelligence. Amanda was no better, making subtle but constant criticisms about the house's maintenance and my ability to care for myself. "I notice the gutters are getting full of leaves," she'd say with false concern. "That could be a real hazard. Thomas can arrange for someone to clean them since you obviously can't do that yourself." The obviously stung. While I wasn't about to climb a ladder at my age, I was perfectly capable of hiring a service, as I had done every fall for years. When I began to push back against their intrusions, Thomas suggested my memory was failing. After I mentioned a specific conversation with Richard about keeping the house, Thomas looked at Amanda with exaggerated concern. "Mom, Dad never said that. I think you might be confusing your wishes with actual conversations." The gaslighting was subtle but persistent. Thomas would move things in my house and then express worry when I noticed they were out of place. He'd ask the same financial questions repeatedly, as though testing to see if my answers remained consistent. He'd remind me of appointments I had allegedly forgotten, though I had no recollection of them ever being scheduled. The situation came to a head at a family dinner where several relatives had gathered. Without warning, Thomas stood up and announced, "I want to update everyone on Mom's situation. I'm helping her sell the house and move into a more manageable living arrangement." The table fell silent as all eyes turned to me. In that moment, I realized just how effectively Thomas had undermined me with our family. They all nodded as though this news was expected and appropriate, not a complete violation of my autonomy. That night, after everyone had left, I called Susan in tears. "I feel powerless against my own son," I admitted. "He's systematically taking over my life, and somehow he's convinced everyone that it's for my benefit." And Susan, who had known me for 20 years and had watched Thomas grow up, was silent for a long moment. "Marjorie," she finally said, "Richard didn't raise you to be a doormat, and he certainly didn't spend his life building financial security for you only to have Thomas sweep it away. You need to stand up for yourself and remember you have options." She was right, of course. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the grief and confusion, I knew Richard would have been appalled by Thomas's behavior and my passive response to it. It was time to reclaim my agency and honor the provisions Richard had thoughtfully put in place to protect me, even from our own son. The breaking point came suddenly, though in retrospect, it had been building for months. Thomas arrived at my house, unannounced, one Tuesday afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with his company's logo. His expression was determined as he laid out several official-looking documents on my kitchen table. "These need your signature today, Mom," he said without preamble. "I've got a notary meeting us here in 30 minutes. I picked up the top document and felt my blood run cold as I read the title, Durable Power of Attorney. The document would give Thomas complete control over my financial and medical decisions. There were other papers too, some regarding the house, others about bank accounts and investment funds. "What exactly is this about Thomas?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. He sighed as though dealing with a particularly difficult client. "Mom, we've discussed this. You need help managing your affairs, and this makes it official, so I can handle things properly." "We've never discussed me signing over power of attorney," I countered, "and I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs." His facade of patience cracked slightly. "Look, I'm trying to help you. Dad left things in a mess, and someone needs to straighten them out before you end up in financial trouble. That was a blatant lie. Richard had been meticulous about our finances, and Thomas knew it. Your father left everything in perfect order, I said. Patricia has confirmed that multiple times. At the mention of Patricia, Thomas's expression hardened. Patricia doesn't have the full picture. She doesn't know about the investment losses or the tax issues. There were no investment losses or tax issues. Now he was simply fabricating problems to justify his interference. I felt a surge of anger, replacing my usual hurt and confusion. Thomas, what is really going on here? I demanded. Why are you so determined to control my finances and sell my home? Perhaps it was my direct tone, so unlike my recent passive responses, but something made him snap. Because I need the money, Mom, he shouted, his face flushing red. Do you have any idea how expensive our lives are? Private school tuition for 2 kids, the mortgage on our house, Amanda's student loans, the country club membership we need for networking. Dad always helped us when things got tight, and now he's gone, and you're sitting on all this wealth while we're drowning in debt. There it was, finally. The truth behind months of manipulation and gaslighting. Thomas wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was fixated on what he perceived as his inheritance. Your father and I worked for everything we have, I said quietly. We saved, we invested carefully. We lived within our means. None of this wealth you think I'm sitting on fell into our laps. Dad would be disappointed in how selfish you're being. Thomas shot back, going for the emotional jugular. He always said family takes care of family. Yes, he did. I agreed. And he took great care to ensure I would be secure after he was gone. That was him taking care of his family, Thomas. Me, his wife of 42 years. Thomas stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I sat at the kitchen table, shaking with adrenaline and a strange sense of clarity. The son I thought I knew had revealed himself to be someone quite different, someone willing to manipulate and bully his widowed mother for financial gain. He returned 2 hours later with Amanda in tow. Their approach had shifted to good cop, bad cop, with Amanda speaking sweetly about how they only wanted what was best for me, while Thomas stood silently, arms crossed in the background. We're just worried about you alone in this big house, Amanda cooed. Wouldn't it be nice to be somewhere with people your own age, where all the maintenance is taken care of? I pretended to consider their suggestions, nodding thoughtfully, and asking questions about the retirement communities they'd researched. This apparent compliance seemed to satisfy them for the moment, and they left with promises to bring brochures on their next visit. As soon as they were gone, I called Patricia and asked her to come over immediately. While waiting, I began making mental lists of what needed to be done to protect myself from my own son. The next day, Thomas returned alone. He headed straight for Richard's study, claiming he needed to look for some old family photos. I knew better now, and followed him, watching from the doorway as he rifled through the desk drawers and filing cabinet I had deliberately left unlocked, filled with innocuous documents. He found some bank statements and turned to me triumphantly. What's this account? And why isn't it in the financial overview you gave me? I shrugged, non-committally, neither confirming nor denying anything. This seemed to frustrate him more than an outright refusal would have. That evening, I received a text message that made my blood run cold. Start packing. The house has been sold. My hands trembled as I stared at my phone's screen. The audacity, the complete disregard for my autonomy and rights was stunning. Thomas had actually attempted to sell my house without my knowledge or consent. My initial shock quickly turned to resolve. Thomas had finally gone too far, and in doing so, he had given me the push I needed to put my own plan into action. The next morning, I called Patricia and asked her to meet me at her office rather than my home. I didn't want to risk Thomas showing up unannounced during our conversation. Patricia's office was a soothing space with soft gray walls and comfortable furniture. She listened intently as I recounted Thomas's text and the events leading up to it. "He can't actually sell your house," she reassured me, pushing her glasses up on her nose. "The property is solely in your name, and without your signature, on a deed, no sale is valid." "I know that," I said, "but the fact that he would even attempt it shows how far he's willing to go. I need to protect myself, and I think it's time to use the contingency plan Richard put in place." Patricia nodded solemnly. She opened a drawer and pulled out a file labeled with my name. Richard was worried something like this might happen. He knew Thomas better than you realized. The memory of one of Richard's final conversations with me suddenly surfaced. It had been a rare good day when the pain medication was working and his mind was clear. "Marjorie," he had said, taking my hand in his, "I've loved Thomas from the moment he was born, but I've watched how he and Amanda live, always wanting more. Promise me you'll protect yourself if he ever tries to take advantage after I'm gone." I had promised, though at the time, I couldn't imagine my sweet boy ever becoming the man who would try to sell his mother's home out from under her. Patricia helped me review all the legal documents Richard had put in place. The house in Spain was indeed solely in my name, purchased 15 years earlier when Richard's company had opened a European office and we had fallen in love with the Valencia coast. The pension fund was ironclad, structured to provide monthly income directly to an account Thomas knew nothing about. "What do you want to do?" Patricia asked after we had gone through everything. "I want to disappear," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. "I want to go to Spain and start over, without Thomas controlling my every move." Over the next week, I began sorting through my belongings, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Each item held memories, some stretching back to the early days of my marriage. The china we had received as wedding gifts. The collection of first edition novels Richard had given me for anniversaries. The photo albums chronicling Thomas's childhood, back when his smile was genuine and his eyes held innocence rather than calculation. I found myself sitting on the floor of our bedroom closet one afternoon, surrounded by photos, tears streaming down my face. I wasn't just grieving Richard anymore. I was grieving the son I thought I had, the one whose kindergarten self-portrait still hung in my study with the words, "I love my mom," printed in wobbly letters across the top. Susan became my confidant and accomplice during this time. She helped me pack essentials without raising suspicion, storing boxes in her garage that would later be shipped to Spain. "I'll miss you terribly," she said, as we carefully wrapped framed photos in bubble wrap. "But I'd rather visit you in Spain than watch Thomas bully you into submission here." Thomas increased his pressure tactics, bringing potential buyers to tour the house while I was supposedly out. I returned early from a fake doctor's appointment to find a couple admiring my living room while Thomas pointed out features as though he were already the owner. The look of shock on his face when I walked in was almost comical. The couple, embarrassed quickly, made their excuses and left. Thomas stayed, launching into an explanation about how they were just friends, interested in architecture. I pretended to believe him, maintaining the facade of the compliant, slightly confused mother he thought me to be. All the while, I was finalizing my escape plan with a precision that would have made Richard proud. The morning of my departure dawned bright and clear, as though the universe approved of my decision. I left a note on the kitchen counter saying I was visiting Susan's daughter in California and would be back in 2 weeks. In reality, I was flying to Spain, with Susan driving me to the airport to avoid leaving my car in long-term parking where Thomas might spot it. "Text me when you land," Susan said, hugging me tightly at the departure gate. "And remember, you're not abandoning him, you're saving yourself." The flight was long, but gave me time to reflect on everything that had happened since Richard's death. The gradual escalation of Thomas's controlling behavior, the subtle and not so subtle attempts to gaslight me into doubting my own competence, the final outrageous attempt to sell my home. By the time the plane touched down in Spain, I felt a sense of both sadness and liberation. The sadness was for the relationship with my son that might never be repaired. The liberation was from the constant pressure and manipulation I had been living under. The taxi drove me through familiar landscapes to the coastal town near Valencia, where our second home waited. The whitewashed villa, with its blue shutters and bougainvillea-draped terrace, looked exactly as I remembered it from our last visit, just before Richard's diagnosis. Inside, everything was as we had left it, thanks to the local property management company that had been maintaining the place. There were even fresh flowers on the dining table, a welcome gesture arranged by Patricia, who had called ahead to announce my arrival. I walked from room to room, trailing my fingers over furniture Richard and I had chosen together. In this space, thousands of miles from Boston, I felt his presence more strongly than I had in months. This had been our special place, our secret sanctuary. Now, it would be my new beginning. The local community embraced me with typical Spanish warmth. Our neighbors Maria and Carlos brought over a homemade paella that evening, expressing their condolences for Richard's passing and their joy at having me back. "Richard was a good man," Carlos said, raising his glass of wine in a toast. "He talked often about how much you both loved this place." I settled into a routine more quickly than I expected. Morning walks along the beach, fresh market shopping, Spanish language classes at the local community center, evenings on my terrace, watching the Mediterranean sunset with a glass of wine and one of the books from the extensive library Richard and I had built over years of visits. Thomas's frantic calls began 3 days after my disappearance. First to my cell phone, which I had turned off before leaving. Then to Susan, who truthfully said she had dropped me at the airport, but claimed not to know my exact destination. Finally, to other family members and friends, none of whom had the information he desperately sought. When he finally discovered I wasn't in California, his messages turned threatening. I turned my phone on briefly a week after arriving in Spain and found 27 voice messages and 43 texts. The final text read, "This is elder abandonment. I'm contacting authorities if you don't call immediately." I sent a simple response. "I've already packed and moved on. The house is still mine." Then I blocked his number, forwarded all communication to Patricia, and continued settling into my new life. Patricia would handle any legal challenges Thomas might attempt, though we both knew he had no legal grounds to force me back or gain control of my assets. One particularly nasty email found its way to me through Patricia. Thomas had written that I had betrayed the family, abandoned my grandchildren, and dishonored Richard's memory. The words stung, but I recognized them for what they were, the desperate lashing out of someone who had lost control over a situation he thought he had managed perfectly. I printed the email, read it once more, then tore it into tiny pieces and let them scatter in the Mediterranean breeze from my terrace. It was time to look forward, not back. 6 months passed, and with them, the raw edges of both my grief for Richard and my pain over Thomas's betrayal began to soften. I was thriving in my Spanish community, my language skills improving daily, my social circle expanding beyond our original friends to include local artists, expatriates from various countries, and even a widower named Miguel, who taught sailing at the local marina. My new routines brought comfort and joy. Morning beach walks at sunrise, coffee at the small cafe in the town square, where the owner now prepared my cortado without me having to order. Spanish classes 3 times a week, where I was proudly advancing from beginner to intermediate level. Weekend markets, where vendors greeted me by name and saved their best produce for La Americana. The pain of family estrangement still surfaced occasionally. Birthdays were particularly difficult. I sent cards and gifts to my grandchildren through Patricia, unsure if Thomas and Amanda would give them to Jackson and Sophia or return them unopened. I missed watching them grow, but refused to sacrifice my dignity and safety to maintain that connection under Thomas's controlling terms. Surprisingly, other family members began to reach out independently. My niece Jennifer emailed to say she had pieced together what happened from family gossip and Thomas's increasingly desperate attempts to locate me. "Uncle Richard would be proud of you for standing up for yourself," she wrote. "And for what it's worth, I think you did the right thing." Thomas made several attempts at legal action, all of which failed due to Richard's careful planning. He tried to claim I was mentally incompetent and needed a conservatorship, but Patricia presented recent medical evaluations proving otherwise. He attempted to challenge Richard's will, but the documents were airtight. He even tried to report me as a missing person, but Patricia provided proof to authorities that I had left voluntarily and was safe. Each failed attempt seemed to diminish his energy for the fight. By the 6-month mark, his legal challenges had stopped entirely. Whether he had accepted defeat or was simply regrouping for another attack, I couldn't know. But the respite allowed me to focus on healing rather than defending. My healing journey progressed in stages, just as grief does. Initially, the pain of betrayal was almost physical, a constant ache that accompanied me through days and kept me awake at night. Gradually, it transformed into something more manageable, a sadness that visited occasionally, rather than a constant companion. I found comfort in unexpected places. In the community of expatriates who had similar stories of family estrangement for various reasons. In Miguel's quiet companionship during sailing lessons, where he taught me to harness the wind rather than fight against it, a metaphor I found applicable to my emotional journey as well. In the simple pleasure of cooking for myself in my sun-drenched Spanish kitchen, preparing Richard's favorite paella recipe, and feeling his approval in the sea breeze that wafted through the open windows. Patricia kept me updated on the situation back home. Thomas had apparently told family members I had had a mental breakdown after Richard's death and was receiving treatment at an undisclosed location. The story didn't hold up long, especially once I began sending postcards to relatives from Spain. I made a deliberate decision to leave the door open for reconciliation, but with firm boundaries. I sent Thomas an email through Patricia with my new address and an invitation to visit when you're ready to accept my autonomy and Richard's wishes for my financial independence. He never responded, but I like to think the information is there for him when and if he ever decides to approach our relationship with respect rather than entitlement. The wisdom I gained through this painful experience is something I wish I could share with every widow or widower facing family pressure. Loving your children doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity or security. The greatest gift Richard gave me wasn't the financial protection he put in place, though that was certainly crucial. It was the understanding that I deserved to be treated with respect, even by my own child. My healing continues daily. Some moments still bring tears, like when I see grandparents playing with children on the beach and remember Jackson and Sophia. But those moments are balanced by new joys, the accomplishment of completing a sailing certification, the satisfaction of carrying on a full conversation in Spanish, the peace of watching Mediterranean sunsets from my terrace. I believe Richard is watching over me, proud of my strength in honoring his careful planning and protecting the life we built together. And in quiet moments, when the sea breeze rustles through the bougainvillea on my terrace, I sometimes feel his presence, a gentle reminder that love transcends both death and betrayal. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect yourself, even from those you love? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if you found strength or insight from my experience, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about standing your ground and honoring your worth. Remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to take care of yourself first. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to protect your peace, just as I found mine in this beautiful Spanish coastal town.